Could we imagine, if we were to imagine a unified political structure that would govern our ummah, how do we actually get there? We need to be studying that which benefits the ummah and which would benefit us and inform our future, inshallah.
To the stage, Dr. Mustafa Salama, who's going to discuss political unification and transformation. Dr. Mustafa is a doctor of political science from Georgia State University. He previously worked as a political analyst and a consultant on international relations to political parties in Egypt during the Arab Spring. He currently heads for political research in the Ummatics Institute, which he helped in its establishment. Dr. Mustafa's.
All right, assalamu alaikum everyone. So my talk will be about our political research agenda and highlights from our political unification research. So I will cover some of the political research agenda briefly because it would help you understand the bigger picture when we talk about political unification. As my colleagues have mentioned before, that we have three main domains when it comes to our research agenda. So I will be speaking about the one in the middle, and as you can see that there are some subtopics that are covered in our research agenda. And alhamdulillah, we have done some research on political unification. And at a moment, I will tell you what does that mean. So what do we mean by political unification in our research? And we've published a literature review that you could go back to and read. However, when we speak about political unification, we're actually talking about two or more states merging. So two or more states that are sovereign, that are complete separate political entities, and those states merge. So counter to common knowledge, there are actually quite a number of cases of this happening, whether as attempts, like for example, the most famous one, Syria and Egypt, that didn't last long. But there are actually cases where this form of political unification has succeeded and has been long-lasting. So why do we study such a thing? So as an ummah, we tend to complain about having so many borders, that we're separate entities, we're politically fragmented like never before in our history. So what should we actually do about it? Or actually, what could we imagine if we were to imagine a unified political structure that would govern our ummah? How do we actually get there? So we could imagine the actual thing, that we could go ahead and say, what does this look like? But we could also say, how do we get there? And if we look into cases of political unification, then we're going to come with lessons. We're going to learn something about how these processes work, and hopefully can inform our future. We certainly are not going to jump into one politically unified structure for the ummah, but if we could have less states, if we could have two or three of these more cases that do occur, then we're actually moving in the right direction. So there is a current example that tends to be neglected, that is moving in this direction, and that is the Confederate of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. So they signed a Confederate treaty in 2024, and they're now, as we're speaking, working on having common institutes that govern certain policy parameters, whether it's an economy or defense. And mind you, the United States did start as a confederate. It was initially a confederate. Then they realized that that a confederacy is perhaps not the best way of governing, and then they moved into a federation. So under this domain or this part of our research agenda, we look into some certain sub-questions. So what are the conditions of these mergers? Like when these conditions, when these mergers happen, what are the typical conditions that we could see across these cases? What are the variables that contribute to their success or failure? What are the incentives of various stakeholders to support or oppose these unification attempts? And also, which Muslim countries are most likely suited to this political unification? Next is governance, statecraft, and political institutions. So if we want to imagine this unified ummah, like what would it look like? What would it look like? So what would its centralize? What would it be centralized or would it be decentralized? Under what conditions does centralization work best or decentralization? And having an effective balance between local representation, where I get to stay Egyptian and no one tells me that I'm not, but at the same time, you're also part of that larger group. You're also part of that ummah, and you are obligated in certain ways towards that larger union. So what are also the institutional design and interrelations between these institutes? What institutes ought to remain with the state? Like now we know that the modern state is much stronger than previous political entities, but which institutes that are now governed by the state actually need to be removed from the state? So like awqaf, what is the role of the ulama? How do they fit in this larger political entity? And also political representation and accountability. So how do we get representation without actually exacerbating factionalism, and also at the same time you're not completely centralizing, that you kind of like start to foster authoritarianism. So, you know, some of these example, like a current example would be Syria, like whether you manage, how do you manage the Kurdish problem, how do you manage the minorities, and so forth would fit into this kind of research. So I want to, so when we put this together, when we put political unification and then like statecraft and government institutions, we get a spectrum of unification. So we could act as many small separate states, and this is increased separation, and it creates a problem of collective action. And you know, in world politics, those who are sitting at the seats of power, they're all large unified entities. They're not like small separate entities that are trying to work together. So what is the political system? There are many small separate states. And this is what we have today. And this is also a part of why we are weak. Another, if we want to move into more integration, more cooperation, and so forth, then we could organize as international organizations. And we have the EU, the NATO, OIC, Arab League, and so forth. These are examples of international organizations. But we could take it a step further and go into a confederation or confederalism. And the EU kind of sits between an international organization and a confederalism. But at the same time, it also creates a problem of collective action, but at the same time, these states maintain their sovereignty. And they're still not as unified as one might wish. A next step over that is federalism, where different states have their own, they're still sovereign, they still have some form of autonomy, but there are certain parameters of policies that they do not have, that they give up to the central government. And this way, so they give a part of their sovereignty to be more prosperous and have greater security. So, and the classic example is the US, and 7 of the 8 biggest countries in the world are federal states. So you have Brazil, the US, Canada, Australia, Russia. They're all federal states, with the exception of China, which is a unitary state. So this would probably be a good example of a way in which we could be united. Then you would have a devolution, which is more integration, but at the expense of local autonomy. So there is a central government, and this central government starts giving some of its power to the peripheries. Or you could have decentralization, where it is, yes, the power is in the central, but you're giving part of the parameters of policies to the peripheries, so that you give them some administrative autonomy, or you're giving them some fiscal autonomy, but at the same time you still keep the power central. Or you could have one large unitary state which governs everything and it's kind of hierarchical, and then that's also less autonomy. So the more you increase integration, the more it becomes centralized, and it's probably going to be problematic because it's very difficult to manage diversity this way. But at the same time, you don't want to be too separated to the point that you can't even defend yourself. You can't even like coordinate in order to defend yourself or coordinate to have a common market and so forth. So you have to kind of strike a balance. And this is part of our research. How do we strike a balance within the Ummah or within a cluster of Muslim states so that we are better able to protect ourselves from external threats, but at the same time be more prosperous and have a larger economy that is synchronized and working together. So moving forward on part of the research agenda is the judiciary system. So how does, like, if you are having all these options that you could explore, what would be the judicial structure within a unified entity? How would you deal with the madhabs, with legal plurality, like with codifying Sharia and so forth? How could we learn from analyzing different Sharia courts? So Sharia is something that we are obligated to rule by, but obviously we don't have that many of them. So in moving to that direction, what can we learn from the current examples of Sharia courts? And also, what can we learn from the transitions to Sharia courts? So Nigeria did not have Sharia courts in its current form. So how did they move towards that? What could we learn from such transitions? And we do have some cases of currently running Sharia courts, whether it's Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan, Iran, Brunei, and Aceh. Similarly, a major part of our political research agenda is looking into political transitions. So the Arab Spring is the classical example. Like, what went wrong, or which ones succeeded, and what can we learn from them? Similarly in Bangladesh, similarly again in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, trying to learn from that process where they're trying to confederate and become more unified. So understanding the dynamics of different types of regime change so that we are able to craft policies for the future. So when another country has a revolution or some kind of regime change or a military coup or whatever regime change happens, let's be prepared in order to know what would be the best solutions that we could craft for those specific cases. So what we would also want to look at the spoilers of political transitions, examining both internal and external spoilers, and also striking a balance between justice and reconciliation. So obviously there are countries that have gone through grave injustices, but sometimes you have to reconcile because that's you could only work, you're so limited with what you already have. And let me move over. All right, so also another part is minority constituents, dealing with or how do we institutionalize protection and representation for minorities within the Ummah. This is something that we want to explore and also exploring the foreign relations of minorities. So minorities obviously have more than one identity. They are part of our community, but at the same time they have affiliations with externalities. So we would like to explore those, and also exploring Muslim minorities as well. So let me move on quickly. So we explored theories and debates on unification. So when we're trying to explain and understand these state mergers that I mentioned earlier, we looked into Western academia to kind of inform us, okay, empirically, how does this work? What are the main variables that are in play? And from a very quick literature review that we've published and you could read, we found that there are four main schools of thought. the neofunctionalists, realists and constructivists, or communitarians and liberalists. But before going and explaining those theories or briefly touching upon them, I'm not going to go in great academic detail, but just like a brief overview. I just wanted to show you some of these unification attempts where two or more states actually try to merge and become under one sovereign government. So this is just from Africa. We have Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, which is ongoing, and it's 2024. It's a very interesting case. I'd encourage you to read its news and follow what's going on. We have also the Union of African States, Ghana, Guinea, and Mali, which lasted a number of years. We have the Senegambian Confederation, which also lasted roughly 6 years. There are more examples, and then we have the United Republic of Tanzania, which was actually Tanganyika and Zanzibar. And those two separate states united on 1964, and we still have it today. Then we have over 18 attempts of Arab unification. So Arabs, know that there are all these unification attempts that mostly have failed. But yeah, we have North and South Yemen, despite the challenges it has today. But this is the successful one. So when we look at these unification attempts and we see why they have failed, we're going to learn something. There are also other unification attempts, whether it's in Southeast Asia or Latin America, and Latin American ones are much more earlier because their independence from colonialism was much earlier. So these were typically attempts that try to overcome colonialism and overcome the challenges of post-colonialism by ganging up and becoming one state so that they are able to fend themselves and their interests. So what are the features of these theories that we have spoken about? So the neo-functionalists typically focus on supranational institutes. So these are institutes that go across nations. They are institutes that govern, let's say, like for example, the central bank of the EU. It governs the economy of the EU. So they would say that, start with supranational institutes, and it's going to drive further unification. So they say that it creates, a common, minimum common denominator across policy parameters. They would say it mediates compromise, and it upgrades interests or forces these states to focus on their common interests and actually further them and expand them and improve them. So they would call this spillover. So they typically look at economic integration as a linear process. So if you economically integrate, you're going to move directly into political integration. So this is in a nutshell, the school of thought or the theory on unification. So the takeaway is start by economic integration, institutionalize cooperation, and then naturally that's the progression. You're going to move into political unification. So this has had its critiques, and it's contested by several scholars. It's looked at as Eurocentric. It sometimes has unintended external effects. So sometimes, yes, states do cooperate on certain policy parameters, but then it creates problems elsewhere. So the idea that it's linear has been argued against. And the main propellant of this theory, Ernest Haas, has said that his theory is obsolete in the 70s, and then he came back in his last book and said, look, no, maybe it's not obsolete. It actually might work. But this is one of the schools of thought. Another one is realism. So those of you who are students of international relations know that there are realist scholars who also explain why states merge. So they have their core assumptions that we are in an anarchic international system, that power politics is what determines the behavior of states on the international scene. So they look at it as rational elites seeking to maximize security and benefits, or economic benefits. That's why that's how they explain why states, or two states or more merge. So they look at it as a federal bargain. So cede part of your autonomy for collective defense and economic gain. And central authority is empowered just enough to counter threats. So the higher the threat, the more likely you are going to integrate. And the success of this bargain depends on balancing central power with constituents' autonomy. So you don't want to give completely your sovereignty. You don't want to have someone in a central government sitting in a building and somewhere in a large city decide everything for you. No, you want them to be able to decide some of your life, but you still get to keep your local autonomy, your local governance, and you get to manage and govern your own community. So the takeaway from this school of thought would be focus on common security concerns and then push for unification. Focus on security cooperation, and then that would push for your unification. So they would oppose the idea that it is economic unification that works first. So there are critiques to this school of thought as well, that unification has occurred despite a lack of common security threats. So Yemen and Tanzania did not really have any external security threats, and they still unified. So maybe perhaps it's not entirely based on power politics, although they would argue that it is most of the time power politics. It ignores identity, values, and norms. So most of these states that we see that have unified, they do actually have some common things beyond materialist interest, beyond just security and just economic benefit. So then we have, moving into another school of thought, a constructivist and communitarian theories. They're kind of close, but not identical. So they focus on shared identity, shared values, shared norms, shared emotional bonds. These are central to unification, to the success of unification. They treat it as dialectical and multi-staged. So we as local communities need to sit down together and decide, okay, we want to govern ourselves in a certain way, but also at the same time, we're part of a larger entity. And the success of this union would entail that loyalty to the higher union ought to be higher than to the subgroups. So if you're in the Ottoman Khilafah, then your main allegiance is not to your Arabs, not to the Kurds, not to the Turks, but to that common union that governs you all, that protects you all, that you have allegiance to. So what is the takeaway here? Foster common identity, local unit agreements first, then larger unit agreements. So you have to agree first with the smaller constituencies, and then with the larger ummah at large, or the larger identity. So the critiques for this are, it is seen as idealistic, overemphasizing identity, underestimates nationalism. So nationalism is still a strong force. It overlooks asymmetries and inequalities in inter-unit dynamics. So it doesn't pay attention, okay, if there's a large state and a small state, how do these dynamics work? Then finally, we have, from Western academia, liberal theories. So there is there's the notion of a security community, which is the stable expectations of peaceful change among polities. Like, we expect we're going to deal with our differences in a peaceful way. That there is a common trust, a we feeling, we're in this together, that it would keep the peace among politics despite the lack of common institutions. So they say that, you don't necessarily need institutes to have peace, but having shared institutes definitely fosters cohesion, and then it makes you move into an amalgamated security community. That's what they call political unification or mergers between states. And this works through institutes. So they would say, when you are creating institutes, it pushes for more communication and interaction among the units, and it also creates a shared identity. They also say that a shared identity is not a precondition for cohesion. So rather, the process itself fosters this identity. So we could be different, we could be diverse, we could have radically different worldviews, but when we engage in institutional building, then that's going to help us communicate with each other, get to know each other more, and push for unification. So what is the takeaway? Focus of this theory, focus on the process of integration, focus on institutional building, and not the preconditions or external actors. So the critiques, again, for this one, for this theory, is that it's Eurocentric, tailored to the EU, ignores power dynamics, and ethno-nationalism. So there are other external factors and conditions which do push for unification. So scholars who study this have looked at wars and economic shocks, which reveal system flaws. So if you go through, a number of small states go through war and they realize that they are radically undermined. So what could they do? They would probably seek a radical solution, which could be in the form of two or more states merging. So these external stimuli or creative crisis create a public demand for extraordinary solutions. Also, that these events typically have what they call as political entrepreneurs, or leaders who persuade the population, their populations, of unification, or seeking the benefit of these merger where you're giving part of your sovereignty in order to achieve security and economic prosperity. So what are the takeaways from all of these different theories? When you look at those theories from a bird's eye view, you would realize that they're kind of like discussions that we already have as an ummah. Should we start with economics first? Should we focus on security first? No, it's identity and values and shared norms that matter the most. No, we should institutionalize cooperation and build institutes. So these are all theories that inform our debates and would inform us on how we could deal with this dynamic problem, with our problem of disunity for the future. So we have, as we mentioned, the neofunctionalists start by economic integration, or the realists say would start with security. And then you would have the communitarians, which would say foster a common identity, or you could focus on integration and institutional building like the liberalists. So moving forward with research. So now that we have this review of how and why states merge, there is further research, and inshallah tomorrow we're having a small private workshop of papers that explore these topics. But we could also look into, which we don't find in the literature, institutions that matter. So when two or more states merge, which institutes are the most salient? Which ones are the most that matter for these mergers? Which designs, whether in fiscal systems, whether it's federal or unitary, whether in civil-military relations or the judiciary, like how would we design these institutes so that we could push for unification? Also, what Muslim institutes and non-state actors matter the most in these unification attempts that make them successful? And also, something that my colleague, Dr. Abdul Rahman, spoke about, unification rightness. So which Muslim countries are most ready to be unified? Can we develop an index of economic, political, and cultural variables that could forecast this likelihood over time? So this is more of a quantitative project. And this could inform us, so whether it's like, let's say, Egypt and Sudan, for example, like what variables matter the most, whether it's the historical narrative or common security threats and so forth. And on this note, I end, and I hope that we are pushing for this kind of research. This is what is not readily available in our current times in political science or international relations, but we ought to inform our social sciences. We need to be studying that which benefits the ummah and which would benefit us and inform our future, inshallah. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much. So we now have an opportunity for questions from our audience here.
Again, I have a question to Dr. Mustafa Salama. So I have a problem with like how the entire project is structured or designed. I believe that why can't we have I think the entire project is structured around this idea or presumption that the Ummatic unification have to be a merger of two or more states at the unit level, at the core. Why can't we retain the sovereignty of the states, which I think would be more realistic, considering the contemporary circumstances? So why can't we retain the sovereignty and still have a unification, Ummatic unification? And I think that this idea might be coming from the understanding that as you have said, small states with sovereignty might be too loose of an integration and might increase separation, as you said. If that's the case, I think we are looking in a wrong direction, that we believe that states would integrate. The whole integration project is centered around the idea that integration should be led by states. And I think, especially after the 2000s, the study of diplomacy, the state-to-state interactions have been changed drastically. Now, it's not at all about the state-to-state interaction. And I see that the role of non-state actors have been undermined in the project. And in fact, the role of this multitude of actors have changed. Their influence have been drastically increased. The diplomacy project have been increased, like network diplomacy. We have track to diplomacy and so on and so forth. So I am asking, can we consider a unification project that is non-state-led, that is independent, that is autonomous of the state and national interest?
Could I ask you, would you desire there to be ultimately two or more states coming together, but this is a means to that? Just a very quick answer to that, please.
So I would consider non-state actors as driving. At the end of the day, we need to legalize the system. So we need states at the end of the day. But I believe that it should be led and the non-state actors should be at the forefront.
Fantastic, great. So
on that note, on states being the most powerful actors, that is why we need to pay attention to states. We need to face the main problem head on. Being a politically unified ummah is an obligation upon us. It's not something that is optional, and we have published 5 papers in this, exploring what the madhahib say on the khilafah, on the imamah. It is an obligation. So whatever the obligation, whatever tries to fulfill this obligation, we need to explore. We need to be brave enough to at least explore that maybe one day we could have this politically unified entity. If and I very much like Dr. Overmeer's example, where he cites NASA saying we're going to colonize Mars. Like, why can't we be ambitious enough to say, like, yeah, if we could have 2 or 3 Muslim states in the next 50 years, like, why not? So the idea of us ignoring non-state actors, no, actually it is. It's in the research agenda, and it's in the gaps that we encourage other scholars to explore non-state actors. So why can't we maintain sovereignty and at the same time be unified? Because at the end of the day, in order to survive, you're going to have to put security first. So if you the classic example would be like, why can't we be just like the EU, right? Would you say that? So the EU gets to, they get to cooperate, but at the same time they maintain their sovereignty. But the strategy, which is international organizations, but we're ignoring a very big beast at the background, which is NATO. So without NATO, EU would have never been possible. And if you want to act as a unified ummah, then you need to align your security concerns. You can't have your security dependence on one great power. Let's say Pakistan depends upon China for its survival, and then another Muslim country is depending upon the US for its security. So at the end of the day, you're definitely going to pin these sub-states, these proxies against each other. And this is a dilemma. This is not something we want. And this is, like, it gets into the speech that I gave in Malaysia. Inshallah, we will have that online. It explains more why we ought to explore that option and not completely neglect it. I'm just saying, explore that option. We already have tons of research on international organizations. We don't really have much research on state mergers. We did have that in the post-colonial period, because that was something that was more popular at the time, and social scientists at the time were exploring it. But now we have given up into neoliberalism and international organizations, which is what is being, so like the Journal of International Organizations, and that is how typically cooperation is viewed. They've given up on state mergers. What I'm saying is, don't give up on state mergers. It's something that we ought to study because no one else is studying it, and it also fulfills a step towards our imama, towards a unified political structure.
So most of what has been discussed is a theory of an ideal world that we can build as the Ummah. And it's rooted in the economy and politically. But the question is, and it goes back to what Dr. Hiba said, are we preparing for war? Because this reminds me of the Black liberation movements that happened around the world in the 60s, 70s, 80s, how they had an idea of a unified alternative model and they were united by a shared ideology, they were united by a shared identity. But the ideas were assassinated before they could even become policy. So in your studies, in the literature that you're looking at, are you also looking at the different ways that this would not be let to happen? And are you creating or theorizing possible solutions for that as well?
Moving on to the next question, are we preparing for war? No, in fact, we're not. This is a very peaceful way in order to achieve unity. It's called voluntary political unification. No one's forcing you to do that. In fact,
I think the question isn't quite that. The question is, are you prepared for the challenges? Maybe that's a better way.
So definitely, if you are a bigger state, which has more economic wealth and more security capabilities, then you're definitely in a much better shape to face the problems. But at the same time, we live in a very politically volatile world, and the possibilities of engaging in such extraordinary solutions are much higher than when we lived in, let's say, the past few decades, where it was a much more stable international system.
I think we have to end this session here. Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for all of you who wanted to contribute. It was a really fascinating Q&A, that actually. I found it really interesting. Jazakallah khair to our panelists for this panel, inshallah.